Welcome to California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance. Over this half hour, we'll be speaking with, I think it's fair to say, a man who was one of the most impactful elected officials in the late 20th century in California. His name is Richard Riordan. He was the mayor of Los Angeles from 1993 to 2001. He has written this book, The Mayor, stated simply. It is a remarkable read about and written by a remarkable man, a man who took California from a place that was really a deep, dark place and brought the city back. And it is my honor to have you on the program. We appreciate it. Before we talk about the nitty-gritty, I want to just kind of have some fun and say, what was your most embarrassing moment as mayor of the city of Los Angeles?
Unfortunately, I had a lot of them.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that.
But I remember I was going to serve lunch at the Van Nuys Jewish Home for the Aged.
Got it.
And when I got there, and I had TV cameras to show how humble I was.
Right, of course.
I looked across the room, and there was a woman in her 90s. And I said, I know that woman well. And I walk over to her.
Okay.
And I said, where have we met? Like, what are contexts?
Right.
And she said, I've never met you before in my life. And I said, well, you know who I am.
Right.
And at this, she gently grabbed my wrist and she said, no, let me take you to the front desk and we'll ask them who you are.
Oh, and the press was there the whole time.
Yep.
That's rough. That's really rough. And it's interesting you talk about humility.
Right.
And I think that as you made the decision to run for office, that was one of the elements you needed to demonstrate to the voters. It is fair to say you're a successful, wealthy man, a successful businessman. And there was this sense that, Dick Riordan, he's a Republican, he'll be out of touch, and he doesn't understand the needs of our city. But yet somehow, in the early 1990s, you were able to talk to Los Angeles in such a way that they put their faith in you. Talk to me about that journey.
Well, it was very difficult because I've been a problem solver, I think, since I was a teenager.
Right.
If I saw a problem, I would try to solve it. And I became famous for that. Janitors at my club would have problems. Anybody would come to me. And when the city of LA in the late 80s and the early 90s had their first economic recession in history, they had the Rodney King riots, and the city was being sold down the river by the media. And so I felt it would be a good cause to do, and Bill Wardlaw, who was my partner and was a political
and what's remarkable about the name Bill Wardlaw, Bill Wardlaw was one of the geniuses behind Bill Clinton's election to the United States presidency, a Democrat. And Bill Wardlaw is a well-known Democrat. And you had been a Republican and still are a Republican. So how does Bill Wardlaw wind up with Dick Riordan?
Well, I think Bill, he wants to be a kingmaker.
Okay.
But also his views are almost identical to mine. You could call him libertarian rather than Republican.
And libertarian in the truest sense, especially on the social side.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, on the Republican side, economically, I'm definitely on the Republican side. As far as education, I think that students, particularly poor students, deserve the best teachers, and the unions don't allow you to do that.
So we'll talk more about that.
But when it comes to things like abortion,
gender equality, same-sex marriage,
and all these things, I mean, the Republican Party is killing itself being involved in these issues, because even if you get a Republican president and legislature, those are not going to be changed. The Supreme Court won't allow it, won't have it. So get on with making the government do a better job of creating jobs for people, of having better schools and things like that.
So let's talk about that governing philosophy. And I want to go back, if I may. In November of 1992, Bill Clinton is elected president. He sweeps California. It was not even close. You had your mayoral primary, was it in March of 93?
March of 93.
And then your election in June?
In June, yeah.
How did you take the city of Los Angeles from voting overwhelmingly Democratic for Bill Clinton to voting for you a Republican 7-8 months later.
Well, I think Bill Clinton helped me
People have said that.
because what he did is he endorsed my opponent, Michael Wu.
Right.
But after endorsing him at the news conference, he said, but you know, Dick Riordan is a great leader, and my wife and I have dealt with him, and he's wonderful. And in the LA Times the next day, Conrad had a cartoon showing Bill Clinton kissing Michael Wu, but with a sign behind his back pointed at me saying, this isn't what it looks like.
That is.
And but this, as Bill Wardlaw told me after this, he said, this opened it up for the liberals on the West Side to vote for you.
And what's so nice about Bill Clinton and you is you grew your friendship, you maintained your friendship, and I got to say, Mayor, the fact that Bill Clinton wrote the foreword to your book, that says something. That really says something.
It does, and if you read that, his thinking was almost identical to mine. And he wasn't thinking like what they call progressive liberal Democrats. Now, you call him a liberal Democrat, but not a progressive Democrat.
Right. And so let's talk about when you and President Clinton were really forced together, and that, of course, the Northridge earthquake. That was, I had mentioned this to you, I lived on Zelza Avenue in Encino. If you took Zelza all the way down, that was in Northridge where the buildings, the apartments collapsed. So I remember those days well.
And then for some reason it bounced over the mountains there and ended up in Santa Monica.
I know, it was a remarkable.
And it was the biggest natural disaster in the history of our country at the time. And what happened that day, I was bounced out of my bed at 7:30 in the morning on the floor, got up and realized in about 10 seconds I'd been through a different type of earthquake. It wasn't the 2 or 3 minute one, it was one with a bang on it, and started putting on my sweat clothes and couldn't get anybody on the phone. So I went in my car. I had my wife come in the car with me to drop her off on the way to the freeway, which was right directly in front of us. And I remember I dropped her off at this condo complex, which are mostly elderly women. And when she got out, some of the people saw me there and said, go to it, Mayor, go to it. And I got on the Santa Monica freeway. It was totally, completely dark then. I couldn't see anything. But it was no cars on it. Started driving along it towards downtown. And all of a sudden I saw these 2 giant lights coming at me on my side of the freeway, and realized almost within seconds it was a truck. So I slightly swerved to get around the truck, and then realized immediately there was a broken bridge in front of me.
Literally. I mean, this is the 10 freeway that had collapsed.
It collapsed. And I would have sailed off that bridge if it wasn't for this truck. To this day, I should find out who was driving the truck. We have the Emergency Operations Center 4 stories below City Hall, with about 40 desks for heads of departments, a big room for the police, and a big room for the fire department. The first thing I did was talk with Bob Yates, head of transportation. We set up a huge map, pointed out where bridges had collapsed. There were 5 bridges over freeways that collapsed. The first one we looked at was Santa Monica. And he told me, he said, the only detour that's feasible has 3 intersections through Culver City. And he said, and I said, okay, well, let's take them over. And he said, no, you have to have permission to do it. He said, well, get me the phone, get the mayor of Culver City. He said, you have to get the permission of the state. They will do a study, hire an outside firm.
We have time for a study. When we come back, I want to hear what happened in terms of getting a study done from the state. We are speaking with Mayor Richard Riordan. He was mayor of Los Angeles in the late 1990s. We'll be right back on California Edition.
In what year did California suffer its strongest earthquake in recorded history? 1857, 1971, 1989, or 1994? The largest recorded earthquake in California struck in 1857 in Fort Tejon with an estimated magnitude of 7.9.
We're back on California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are spending the half hour with Richard Riordan, mayor of Los Angeles from 1993 to 2001. Sir Los Angeles had struggled in the wake of the Rodney King riots before you were elected. Within a couple of years of your election, we were hit with the Northridge earthquake. It actually was within a year, the Northridge earthquake. You were talking about how the Santa Monica Freeway had collapsed. You wanted to create some detours, and your head of transportation said you need to get a study.
Right.
A study. We have time for a study.
And study by the state, which
Right.
you've ever known that.
Yeah.
And at this point, I said, look, I'm the business mayor.
Right.
I want you to have 5 minutes
Right,
to take
exactly.
over the 3 intersections.
Right.
And here's my home telephone number.
Right.
If anybody complains, give them my number.
Right.
And they can call me and I'll ask for forgiveness.
Exactly. You can ask for permission or forgiveness.
And that was the motto of my administration, right from beginning to end, was it's much easier to get forgiveness and permission
Right.
in government. And it was great. And literally, through the 8 years I was mayor, only one person complained, and that was Rita Walters, who couldn't trust a white Republican
You think?
person. She was a good city councilwoman,
Right.
but she couldn't do that. And she says Riordan has no respect for agendas or anything.
And so how did you deal with the city council? Because look, it's a fairly strong city council
Yep.
by charter. 15 members, a lot of press on each member of the city council, overwhelmingly Democratic.
Yep.
How are you able to navigate those waters?
Well, going backwards and then forward,
Please.
I eventually, I had a new charter voted by people, which was a very complicated thing to get done. And in it, I provided that the mayor has the right to hire and fire heads of departments.
I remember that.
Up to then, the city council, if I wanted to get rid of somebody, they could veto me by 2/3,
Right.
a 2/3 vote. And then these people were clever enough to get before I decided to fire them, to get the votes of the city council. So it was virtually impossible
Right.
to get rid of them. So that was a positive thing. Now the other part of it is, I would tell my staff, if somebody was really bad, you find out a way to get rid of this person. And you know something? They always did find a way. And
Which begs the question, because you were running
Yeah.
the city as if it was a corporation, a
Right.
business, and there are attributes to that and downsides to that. And there were suggestions that you were acting in an imperial fashion, and you weren't acting in a collaborative fashion
Right.
vis-a-vis your city council partners. So how did you navigate those
well, actually,
assaults?
I think the city council one-on-one
Right.
agreed with me. I got along socially with virtually all
Who
of
was
them.
the president of the city council? I'm trying to think back.
John
then.
Ferraro.
John Ferraro, okay.
And he and I pretty much ran the city together. And Ron Deaton was his chief of staff,
Sure. Well, still
and
around,
who
right.
eventually became head of Department of Water and Power.
Right.
But and the rest of the people, we were
Right.
friends on the side. But the one thing I learned in government is you need the unions in democratic areas to get elected. So even though they may like me, they may like what I say, if the unions doesn't like it, they're not going to vote. In fact, if you look at the federal government, somebody in Congress has to run every 2 years. They have a 2-year term.
Right.
They are elected one time. What do you think the first thing they do? Raise money for the next time election. And if you go back to Washington, like I have meetings with a lot of the congressmen and some of the senators, and before dinner at night, they'd go to 2 or 3 PAC meetings,
Right.
and then we'd have dinner.
Speaking of elections, you, if you wanted to be mayor again, needed to run for re-election.
Yeah.
And you had to run for re-election in 1997, right after Democrat Bill Clinton walloped his Republican opponent, Bob Dole, and California was becoming even more Democratic, based upon your 1993 run. Yet your 1997 race, I mean, was it even a race? You just completely swamped the competition.
Yeah, I did like 2-1.
Yeah.
Tom Hayden, who was famous
Right.
for the
For a whole host of reasons.
a lot of the
Right.
verses of the
Right.
thing, was a good competitor for me because
Right.
I think people saw him what he was. People, I think by then realized I wasn't a super right-wing Republican.
But still, To win in a city as democratic as this one by a 2-to-1 margin, that's remarkable.
Yeah. Well, again, making friends with people.
Right.
Like I got 2/3 of the Latino vote.
Could you imagine today a Republican in California, in Los Angeles, you're the envy of all Republicans nationwide. How? Why was the Latino community in your camp? What were you doing?
Something Ronald Reagan taught me is be friendly with everybody you meet, from the poorest to the wealthiest. Look them in the eye, smile at them, learn from each other. And I think a lot of the Latinos saw that, and they also saw what I was doing for their kids in school. I was doing a lot of...
and we're going to talk about your education reform efforts since you left the mayor's house. And I want to speak with you, if I may. I think most people presumed that you would become governor of the state of California. It didn't happen. What happened?
Well, I ran in the primary against Bill Simon, and I think it was Bill Jones or Dave.
Yeah.
And I was way ahead of them originally.
Way ahead.
Way ahead. In the polls against Gray Davis, who was the governor, showed I beat him by a wide margin. So he got smart, and he put $12 million to beat me in the Republican primary.
Which was, like you said, quite intelligent. I remember that. I mean, you had all these ads against Dick Riordan, and it would say paid for by, a Democratic organization. Like, wait, he hasn't even won the primary.
Well, and then also the super right-wing Republicans who, all of my social sides of things came out against me and they had ads calling me the devil. And
Well, that was when I learned the term rhino, Republican in name only.
That's right.
I mean, that was really, you were the original rhino.
Yeah.
And, one would have thought that may have been to your advantage. Today you would have run in an open primary.
Yeah.
You and Mr. Davis probably would have both advanced, and you presumably would have taken him down.
Yeah, I probably would have. Right now, if I voted for Obama, his first run, the second one I didn't vote for him, and I think he turned out to be a terrible president.
Why?
Why? Because he doesn't know how to manage.
What does that mean?
He doesn't know how to manage. Means to empower other people to get the job done, to have close people to you who are very bright on issues and not making all the decisions yourself.
How would you compare him to George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, who you both knew well?
Well, I think Clinton, very obviously, Clinton had strong people around him. He empowered them. He was very bright. He was friendly with the Republicans in the Senate. As far as George W. Bush, somewhat the same. George W. Bush knew how to make eye contact with everybody. He had a great personality. He wasn't the most brilliant guy in the world. Like on Katrina in Iraq. On Iraq, if I were the president then, I would have had a strong person take over, like Jack Walsh from GE or somebody like that, take over to run this country. But what he did, he had a third level bureaucrat, Brenner, take over. The first thing he did was disband the Republican Army there, so they had no security for us. And the rest is history.
When we come back, I want to talk more about your book, The Mayor, and I also want to talk about why you are considered not only one of the greatest mayors LA's had, but one of the greatest ex-mayors LA has had, and what you've done since you've left the mayor's office. My name is Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back on California Edition.
In what year did California elect a mayor of Los Angeles as its governor? 1889, 1917, 1933, or 1947? Only one individual has gone from mayor of Los Angeles to governor of California. William Stevens, who only served as mayor for 2 weeks in 1909 to fill a vacancy pending election, was elected governor in 1917.
Welcome back to California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We're spending the half hour with Dick Riordan. Richard Riordan, he was the mayor of Los Angeles from 1993 to 2001. He is the author of this book, The Mayor. It is a very accessible read. I urge you to get it, and it's doing great. It's on its third printing, so apparently people like it. As I mentioned before, you have been considered a great mayor, and now you're being considered as a great ex-mayor. Talk to us about what you've been doing, including and especially talking to students at UCLA.
I teach leadership at the UCLA Management School to graduate students. I have 5 axioms of a great leader. One is courage, like only a mediocre person never makes a mistake. A courageous person takes the risk of making mistakes. A caring person, that's the one Ronald Reagan taught me to do. Care about everybody, learn from everybody. Empowering everybody, surround yourself with the brightest and best people as your public employees and also in the private sector, and use them and empower them, like I did Eli Broad in building Disney Center, Steve Soberoff in doing the railroad down to the ports, and of course Staples with Charlie Isgar and Steve Soberoff. They all made that happen, but I gave them the power. And then the last, relentless pursuit of goals. Be a closer. Just get it done. Or Hillel said, the Jewish rabbi, it's much easier. Ask, if not now, when? If not me, who? And then a last one, which I question whether I can teach anybody, is a sense of humor.
And people say you have one. People say you have a great one. And so how did you infuse those principles while you were mayor?
I would tell every employee I had, do not think about what the mayor wants. Do not think about how you're going to make a mistake and embarrass me. You just come in and figure out what is the best for LA and go do it. And I'll tell you if I think you're wrong, but don't. And I constantly had an open door.
And you still do.
Yeah.
And part of the reason you do is because of the Riordan Foundation. And the Riordan Foundation has focused, like a laser beam, for some time on education and education reform. Talk to us about what you've been doing in that arena.
Well, we were, I think, the first people in the country, along with IBM, to put computers into schools and to teach children with the computers. We had the Writing to Read, which taught from kindergarten to 2nd grade how to read and write. And it was a miracle. And also, we're involved in charter schools. I am head of 12 African American charter schools that were going bankrupt 3 years ago. And I say that the most difficult and most important thing I ever did was to save those schools. And they're prospering now.
It's so interesting when you think about education reform. It feels as if the state is fairly schizophrenic, because on the one hand, you have a lot of support for charter schools, for reform of teacher tenure, teacher dismissal. I'm sure you're aware of the Vergara case. But on the other hand, when we had a recent election for superintendent of public instruction, there was a real clear choice. Tom Torlakson, a very good man indeed, was, one could say, not as strong of a supporter of education reform as his opponent, Marshall Tuck. And it became a battle between reform versus no reform, and yet in the end, California, which seemed to be reform-minded, did vote for the status quo candidate.
Well, I supported Torlakson, the status quo, and you have to be loyal in politics. And he was very loyal to me. Anything I wanted, he made happen. And particularly blended learning, where you blend computers with other learning.
So do you feel as if my characterization wasn't fair?
No, I think it is. And Marshall, I have a lot of respect for Marshall Tuck. The first thing I did after the election was over and Torlakson won, was to call Marshall Tuck and arrange a meeting with him to say, I want to have some ideas on how you and I can get together and reform education.
And so how's that going? How is, I mean, where do we go from here? Because the reason I say it is, I know a lot of people in the education reform movement, and they're a bit dispirited. You know,
No.
they feel frustrated. They feel like they had a chance to really shake it up. And the fact that Mr. Tuck was not successful has deflated them.
Well, he came pretty close.
He did.
And that's California. Now, the rest of the country, the charter schools did very well.
I mean, reform candidates were winning in November.
Yeah. So what I say, most people don't know what charter schools are.
Right.
Just some vague thing. The unions say, well, it's people, rich people like Mike
Right.
Bloomberg and Eli
Right.
Broad,
And Dick Riordan.
and trying to buy
Right.
buy the schools.
Right.
And so what I thought with Marshall, what we could get together and market, let people know that the big thing about charter schools is the principals there have the power to hire
They're
and fire
empowered. It's your third
teachers.
principle.
Yeah, power people, and you can do education for about half the cost that the public schools charge.
What do you tell your friends who have children
Yeah.
that are school aged and they're grappling? Do I spend the money and send my kids to private school, or do I hope for the best, put them in a public school, put them in a charter school? What do you tell them?
Well, I'm Catholic, and I
Right.
work with the Catholic.
Well, that's true.
And I think they should send it to a school that safety is an important thing, probably the most important in
Right.
a poor
Oh,
person's
of course.
mind, and and religion education, and to the extent that they can reach those, they should go. Whether it's Catholic
The parochial schools?
or like that, but the Catholic schools, you have to raise about $5,000 a year per child.
But they're less than the private schools, the non-sectarian.
Oh, yeah, non-sectarian.
yeah.
But even a poor Latino, that's
Right.
a lot of money, $5,000 a year.
But what about those families that can't afford a Catholic school?
And those that can't afford it, if we and the Catholics can't find ways to help them do that, I think they should pick charter schools in LA. But in some areas, the public schools are just as good as the charter school.
Right. Some, indeed. If I may, and if you're uncomfortable with this, let me know. There have been 3 mayors since you've been mayor.
Oh boy.
Jim Hahn, Antonio Villaraigosa, and now Eric Garcetti.
Yeah.
What are your senses of those 3 men?
Well, Jim Hahn is a nice guy,
Right.
but I don't think, he didn't get much done. In fact,
One term.
we had a plan for the airport already adopted and CEQA and everything,
Right.
and he deep-sixed that
Right.
because of the environmentalists. He deep-sixed a partnership I had with the state of Utah on power. Again, the environmentalists.
Right.
But he did a great job in picking Bratton as the chief of
Yeah,
police.
indeed.
And I give him a lot of credit. Villaraigosa, the first 6 years he was mayor, I thought he was the worst possible
Interesting.
one. And then all of a sudden, he must have read my book before,
Exactly.
before I wrote it.
Right, right.
And he started to pick people he empowered. He picked Gay Wilson, who was one of my deputy mayors,
Right.
as his chief of staff. He got Austin Buettner, one of my best
Sure,
friends,
sure, yeah.
to run the economy of the
Right.
city. He got Joan Sullivan, a very close friend of mine,
Right.
to be in charge of education.
And what about Eric Garcetti? Bright young mayor. I mean,
He is the enigma because he is probably the brightest president we've ever had.
well, some say he may be president, but he's mayor now.
Or say
Yeah,
president.
exactly right.
To be, and he is very articulate,
Right.
but he doesn't know how or want to get things done.
Do you feel
And he
though,
powers himself with, he surrounds himself with weak people.
it feels like the first year was kind of a learning curve, but now he seems to be making some noise.
It's noise, but not real projects. I'm
Call
with
him.
him.
So why don't you call him?
I have. We got together. It took me 2 months to get a meeting with him, which
Really?
is
That's surprising.
It would have taken him a half hour when I was
Yeah,
mayor.
that's surprising.
But
Okay.
I got together and we talked about it,
Yeah.
transportation, what I could do, what other people could do for him in it, and he really hasn't followed that.
Wow. His name is Richard Riordan. He was mayor of the city of Los Angeles from 1993 to 2001. He is the author of this book, an outstanding read. It is called The Mayor. Mayor, I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's been
Brad,
my honor and pleasure.
thank you very much.
You bet. This is California Edition.